Muy buenos días. Les damos la
Good morning. We'd like to cordially welcome you to the Regional Roundtable of Latin America, which is organized by IPSASB and FOCA. My name is Kamira Sánchez, a member of IPSASB, and I will be here as a panelist in the roundtable. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you a few housekeeping matters on the session. The estimate duration of the session will be 2 hours. The presentation will be taped and will be available after the seminar, as well as the presentation. Microphones and cameras of participants will be deactivated. However, we ask you to write down all your questions on the Q&A icon, which is at the bottom of your screen, because after every presentation, we'll take time to respond your questions live with the panelists. Let's move to the next one, please. We have simultaneous interpretation into Spanish. In order to activate it, please click the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. Please select the Spanish language. Once you've selected the Spanish language, click again on the interpretation and activate silence the original audio or turn off the original audio so that there'll be no interference and you can listen. Now, I would really like to introduce you to the panelists that will be with us here today. Let me ask the panelists to please switch on your camera so that I can introduce you. This roundtable is comprised of Juan Torres García, the president of FOCAL. We have Ross Smith, the technical director and the program director of IPSASB. We have Dave Warner, adjunct director of Ipsas, and Laura Leka, the director of IFAC of the PAIB advising group and of the public sector. Let me now give the floor to Dr. Juan Torres García, the president of FOCAL, who will give us a few welcoming words. Please go ahead, Juan. Thank you, Camila. Good morning. I'd like to thank you for the support provided by the Ipsas board, especially by its president, Janka Reuters. Thank you very much. Because of a personal matter, the president of Ipsas board could not be with us, although would like to thank you all for participating here. We have Ross Smith. Good morning, Ross, and thank you for being here today. I'd like to also welcome all our colleagues and members of FOCAL, which is the Government Accountants of Latin America. Thank you for joining us today. We are gathered in order to have the working roundtable in order to learn about the midterm program of IPSAS board on the strategy of 2019-2023, work on global norms, and IPSAS board will tell us about the current projects, and the member countries will be able to comment on and participate in the process of creations of standards. Let me take the opportunity to tell member countries that, yesterday we sent all the comments that we got from the countries of the project of norm 77, 78, 79. And thank you, Mr. Paul, for helping us technically for all your technical systems. Welcome here, and let me give the floor to Rose Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Torres, for the kind welcome. The IPSASB is very grateful to join you today for this regional roundtable, and we're very happy to be partnering again with the FOCAL network to engage with our constituents here in Latin America. This is the third co-hosted roundtable we've held together with FOCAL for the Latin American community. The first two were in-person events in 2018 and 2019 that were very important in shaping our strategy and work program. So we're very thankful to be working again with FOCAL and to be engaging with constituents in Latin America. Latin America in particular is a very important constituency to the IPSASB, given the very high levels of IPSAS adoption implementation and progression towards accrual accounting in the region. So it's very important for us to hear from constituents from the Latin American region in particular. And I'm very happy that we have Kamira Sánchez, our Latin American member from Panama, attending today. And we also have Mrs. Patricia Varela from Brazil representing Latin America and the country of Brazil in the IPSASB work. This slide here is just a quick overview of what we'll cover today. And I won't go through it in great detail, but you can really break today's discussions into 3 buckets. So first, we're going to spend some time speaking about the mid-period work program consultation that is still ongoing and is out for comment until November 30th. And we're very eager to hear comments from the Latin American community on which projects that we've proposed should be considered for the work program going forward. Also, we will give an update on some key projects, and just to thank, again, the Focal Network for providing a number of comments on consultations over the last few years, and thanks again for just as of yesterday providing with a great deal of feedback and comments. It's very much appreciated, and without the support of the Focal Network, I know it would be very difficult to get so many countries engaging and supporting our consultations. So we're very thankful for that. And then finally, we'll have a little bit of an update from Laura Leka at IFAC to talk about some interesting adoption implementation activities that have been ongoing to help with the migration to accrual accounting and support constituents in that movement. Next slide, please. Before jumping into the detailed discussions, there's a few points that I'd like to highlight. I'm not going to cover every point on this slide, but there's a few I'd like to talk about to provide a little bit more context in relation to the IPSASB's work and the Ipsas themselves. Firstly, just to highlight that the IPSASB is the only international standard setting board focused on developing standards for the public sector. We're based in Toronto, Canada, and that's where our staff is headquartered, but the board itself is a global board with representation from all around the world. I'll speak a little bit more on that on the next slide. The IPSASB follows its public sector conceptual framework in its standard setting activities, and we have a full suite of accrual Ipsas standards, as well as a cash basis standard that's meant to help entities with the transition and migration to accrual. And finally, we have 3 recommended practice guidelines that deal with broader financial reporting. The IPSASB has independent oversight and governance under the Public Interest Committee, which is a group of members representing the IMF, the OECD, the World Bank, and INTASI, the International Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions. We also have an independent advisory board called the Consultative Advisory Group that is a broad group of public finance professionals with diverse perspectives that provide the IPSASB input and advice on its strategy, its work program, and on technical matters on specific projects. And it's a very helpful part of the IPSASB's governance process, the advice we received from the Consultative Advisory Group. Next slide, please. As you can see from this slide, the board is really a global board. We have a remunerated chair, Mr. Ian Crothers, who again sends his apologies for not being able to join today. And we have 17 members representing literally all parts of the globe. And we're very grateful for the volunteer members who support the work of the IPSASB. And again, I'd like to highlight that we do have representation from Latin America, and I think you know Ms. Kamira Sánchez quite well, and I think you also know Ms. Patricia Varela from Brazil, who are very important members in the Latin American community and help us engaging through the Focal Network, as well as through other events and opportunities to engage in Latin America. So we're very thankful for that. Next slide, please. And just before we jump into the work program discussion, I did want to spend a little bit of time talking about the IPSASB's strategy and work program that it approved in 2019. And again, that was very helpful having the events in Latin America and to receive input from constituents in the Latin American community. And at the heart of the IPSASB's strategy is its strategic objective, and that is strengthening public financial management globally through increasing adoption and accrual-based Ipsas. And I think Latin America really is at the heart of the movement to accrual globally at the moment, with a number of well, almost all Latin American jurisdictions strongly implementing accrual accounting and moving towards the use of accrual, and in many cases using accrual Ipsas, which is great to see. In delivering its strategic objective, the IPSASB really breaks down its activities into two broad groups. The first, in the bottom left of the slide, which is developing global standards. And of course, that's the reason for the board's being, and the reason for our work and engagement with constituents is to develop global standards that are fit for purpose for use in the public sector. But another important aspect of our work really falls into the bottom right of this diagram, where we inspire implementation, and we work with various organizations to help raise awareness of the benefits of Ipsas and the benefits of accrual adoption. And that's really at the heart of our roundtables today and our outreach and engagement with constituents and working with other organizations such as FOCAL to help with the migration to accrual accounting. So this is quite an important part of our aspect that I wanted to set out before we start discussing the details of today's presentation. So with that, that's the end of my introduction. I'd like to pass it over to Kamira to walk us through the work program proposals. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Rose.
Well, thank you, Rose. In fact, the consultation for the work program, mid-period work program is very important for IPSASB. As part of the strategy, IPSASB committed to have a public consultations in order to find feedback on the projects that IPSASB should include in its working plan. Projects that IPSASB has proposed in this consultation document would begin in 2022 and 2023 as resources become available. Of course, that this prioritizing of projects has not been very easy because there are many, many other subjects that IPSASB could try and approach. Projects that, after public consultations, do not become a priority could also be considered for instance, at the research program of IPSASB, or could be included in the working plan for 2024 through 2028. I must mention that IPSASB is also interested in knowing your opinion on the proposed projects in order to validate that the working program is, in fact, working on the needs and priorities of countries in Latin America. Without further ado, let me give the floor to Dave Warren so that we can see the details of this proposal. Dave, please.
Thank you very much, Kamira, and thank you very much to FOCAL for giving me the opportunity to speak about the mid-period work program. This is a document that I spent the first half of 2021 working on, so any opportunity that I get to hear from constituents, I'll always take, and I'm always happy to speak about the document and dive in a little to its development. Just before I go into the document, I wanted to remind listeners that we asked them to use the Q&A function to raise questions. We will raise them live at the end of each of the sessions and have a short discussion, having some panelists come on and provide responses. Any Q&A questions that aren't answered in the session will be provided with answers in a follow-up email after the session. With that, I'll move into the mid-period work program consultation. Something that Kamira said, but I think it's very important to highlight because I'll kind of give some of the background, but what this all leads to is what the IPSASB is really asking its constituents as part of this document is what projects should be added to the work program in 2022 and 2023. The other point I wanted to really highlight that Kamira touched on is this mid-period work program consultation really takes place within the context of the existing strategy. And what I mean by that is the mid-period work program consultation was actually considered as part of the strategy. So back in 2018 and 2019, when the strategy was being developed, the IPSASB decided that about halfway through, so in 2021, they would reach out and determine which projects should be added to their work program in the latter half of the strategy period by asking its constituents. And the reason they did this was for a few reasons, but I'll really touch on 3 of them. The first one relates to where the IPSASB currently is in its work program. I won't go through this slide necessarily in a lot of detail, but what I really want to focus on is the right-hand side of this slide, so that the right-hand column. And what you'll see is, and this is important to focus on, is some of our bigger projects, so the top few, so revenue and transfer expenses, and then as we move into the measurement suite of projects, ED 76, ED 77, ED 78, and 79, you can see all of these are starting to wrap up in 2022 and maybe a little in 2023. But what that means from the IPSASB's perspective is we're beginning to have resources open up, both at the IPSASB level and at the IPSASB staff level, in order to take on further projects. So as a result, this is actually a really excellent time for the IPSASB to line up what projects should be added to its work program as resources become available. The second reason that this is an important time for the IPSASB to ask its constituents which projects should be added to the work program really relates to the mix of projects that are now available. I'll talk to each of these graphs individually and kind of the points I'm trying to emphasize here, but if I start on the left-hand side, this graph is trying to illustrate which standards the IPSASB currently has and where it's projected to be that are public sector specific. And at the very top, we have 2 lines that come out of a quarter circle. And those are standards that exist currently that have very little public sector specific guidance. And then if I go down to the very bottom, you'll see a full circle, and those are public sector specific standards. So guidance that's just devoted to the public sector and was developed from the ground up for the public sector. And what you can see is in almost all cases, we're moving more and more standards with more and more public sector guidance. So what that means is on this side of the slide, there's fewer and fewer gaps in the IPSASB's literature as the board becomes more and more mature. On the right-hand side of the slide, the second graph really focuses on those standards that relate to standards that are aligned with the private sector standards, IFRSs. And in this case, if you start at the very top, that reddish box, that illustrates standards that are not aligned at all with IFRS. And then as we work our way down, the green box, those are standards that are 100% aligned with IFRS. And again, you'll see when I compare that light blue line, the September 21 line, to where we expect to be in December 2022, you see that the IPSASB will have made significant progress in closing any gaps, any unnecessary gaps between IFRS and Ipsas. And what this really says is there's fewer projects that are really low-hanging fruit for the IPSASB, so projects that are really easy for the IPSASB to take on. And that's because, like I said, there are fewer gaps in its literature as the IPSASB is moving forward. And as you'll see when I start to talk about the projects, that's really changed the type of projects that the IPSASB is able to add to its work program in 2022 and 2023. The last reason that I wanted to highlight is the real push globally, moving more and more to an accrual basis of accounting. I won't get into the details of this slide because you'll see this slide come up again when Laura talks about some of the adoption and implementation activities that IFAC is undertaking. But the real takeaway from this slide is the trend of that green bar. So if you look in 2018, while a significant number of countries were on partial accrual accounting, there was still a large number of countries in this red bar that were applying cash accounting specifically. But as we move out to 2030, what you'll see is a significant uptake in accrual accounting. And as a result, what that really means for the IPSASB is more and more demands on its resources and different types of demands on its resources. So when there are fewer and fewer users of Ipsas globally, what the IPSASB really needs to focus on is adoption really and getting that number up. But as we move to the future and look forward to the future, the IPSASB will begin to refocus its development and make sure that its standards are easier to apply in practice and that there's more interpretation guidance available for those that are applying Ipsas. So I said that this mid-period work program consultation all occurs within the context of the current strategy. And that's important to note because this mid-period work program consultation, like I said, is focusing on which projects can be added to the work program in 2022 and 2023. This consultation is not looking to make any changes to the strategy itself. Now, what the strategy did outline very specifically is this consultation is limited to the work program itself. And what that means from an IPSASB perspective is, if you go back to the slide that Ross presented where you had two boxes at the very bottom that related to the strategy, and I believe on the bottom left there was an orange box, and that talked about developing global standards. And this is really the core work program that the IPSASB is focusing on with this consultation. And in the work program itself, there are three themes that we like to work within, or that we work towards in deciding which projects should be added. The first are our Theme A projects. Those are public sector specific projects. Those are projects that relate primarily to transactions that are unique to the public sector, or they may share similarities with the private sector, but there's some uniqueness to them in the public sector that requires some kind of different accounting. Some projects that come to mind right now is the majority are a revenue project. We're focusing on public sector specific guidance. And then our natural resource project, which I'll touch on in a few minutes, is another public sector specific project. Our Theme B projects, these are IFRS alignment projects. These projects really focus on aligning Ipsas with IFRS, where the transactions in the private sector and the public sector are the same, and the IPSASB has made the conclusion that accounting for them should be the same. An example of this would be our financial instruments project, which concluded a few years ago, but the conclusion was that if you have a financial instrument in the private sector, so shares in a public company or publicly issued bonds, or even something as simple as cash, that should be accounted for the same way in the public sector as the private sector, because those transactions and those instruments themselves are the same. Our third stream, or our third theme, are our Theme C projects. And these are broader public sector guidance for financial reporting. I'll touch on this at the very end of our natural resources session, but I'll speak quite a bit about this in the context of sustainability reporting. So I'll say stay tuned on Theme C. This slide is really the heart of the mid-period work program consultation. And what you'll see from this slide are the projects that the IPSASB proposes be put forward and included in the 2022-2023 work program. And the IPSASB really broke these proposals into its major projects and its minor projects. And this distinction really falls down to the lines of the resource commitments that will be required by the IPSASB in order to move these projects forward. Our minor projects, the IPSASB expects to require an exposure draft and a final pronouncement phase. This is because these projects are starting from a very strong base. So you'll see in my box here that a number of them are update projects. We already have Ipsas where the IPSASB has a base to work with. Whereas in the right-hand box are major projects. The IPSASB is of the view that these are resource-intensive projects. And that's really because in both cases, while there is some base to start with, there's a lot more greenfield thinking that the IPSASB will have to undertake and the IPSASB staff. And what this means is with these larger projects, the IPSASB expects to require an additional phase as part of developing these standards, and they call that the consultation paper phase. And as part of the consultation paper phase, which is optional but does happen before the exposure draft phase, the IPSASB is really developing preliminary views and is putting those out to constituents to determine whether they're on the right track with the project. So I'll start with our minor projects, so that box right in the middle of the slide, and then I'll move to the major projects. If I start in the top left of the box, so that gray circle, that's Ipsas 21, and that's impairment of non-cash generating assets. And this is a project that the IPSASB has significant interest in for a couple of reasons. The first is this standard is challenging to apply in practice. And that's not necessarily because there are challenges with the standard, but it's trying to record transactions for items that are challenging to account for in practice. So it's actually the underlying transaction that's difficult to account for. And what I mean by this is when you're accounting for non-cash generating assets, to me, those are really your public sector assets. So your schools, your roads, your hospitals. And the challenge that this standard presents is measuring those individual public sector assets is challenging the best of times. When you're trying to measure impairment, that becomes even more challenging. So as an example, if a public sector entity is operating a public school, and that public school has a capacity of 500 students, but only it's only operating at half capacity, so 250 students are attending. The challenge is that public school itself impaired? And if it is, how do you calculate that impairment? If this was in the private sector, those students would probably be paying a tuition or some sort of fees to attend, and the reduced number of students would result in a reduction in cash flows, and that would help with a evaluation of the school. But in the public school, because often there are no tuition or fees associated with attendance, it can be very difficult to, again, measure the value of that school and then determine whether it's impaired. The second reason that the IPSASB believes it's important to update Ipsas 21 right now is as part of the measurement project that just closed yesterday, actually. That measurement project proposed a new measurement basis, current operational value. And as part of reviewing those measurement bases, what the IPSASB noted is Ipsas 21 uses value in use as a measurement basis. Also, Ipsas 26, impairment of cash generating assets, uses value in use. And then the conceptual framework also discusses value in use. And what you'll see there is inconsistency in how value in use is defined. And this would be an opportunity for the IPSASB to align its value in use guidance. When I move to the next minor project, and this is the orange box on my screen, Ipsas 31, intangible assets. Similar to the Ipsas 21 project, one of the reasons the IPSASB wants to update Ipsas 31 is some of its ongoing projects right now have highlighted areas that can be improved in this guidance. And the first one is related to natural resources. I'll get into this a little more in the next session, but our natural resource project focuses on tangible natural resources. Intangible natural resources are out of scope. And as that project sees more clarity and moves out of the consultation phase and more into the exposure draft phase, this provides the IPSASB the opportunity to look at intangible natural resources and look at them in the context of Ipsas 31. The second reason the IPSASB wanted to look at this project goes back to the public sector specific measurement basis that I just discussed as part of the measurement project. And as part of the measurement project, this public sector specific measurement basis was proposed to be applied for property, plant, and equipment, which is our current Ipsas 17. Some board members discussed at the time if it's applicable for property, plant, and equipment. Should the IPSASB also consider whether this public sector specific measurement basis also applies for intangible assets? So that would be something else the IPSASB would consider looking at if this project was to be updated and taken onto the work program. As I move to the green circle, Ipsas 33, first time adoption of Ipsas. This is a really important standard for the IPSASB as more and more stakeholders around the world move to an accrual basis of accounting and some form of Ipsas. And that's really because this is the first touch point that IPSASB preparers or users have with the standards. And with some jurisdictions beginning or have already applied IPSAS 33, this provides the IPSASB the opportunity to learn from those adoptions, look at some of the accounting policy options that exist under IPSAS 33 to determine whether they are applicable, whether they should be changed, whether more accounting policy options are required, really just to support those constituents around the world who want to apply IPSAS and make that transition easier for them. The last project I want to talk about in the minor project bucket is this little light blue circle in the bottom right. And this is making materiality judgments. And what the IPSASB has heard on numerous occasions is when preparing financial statements and determining which disclosures should be required, a significant number of public sector entities, and this isn't necessarily unique to the public sector, it's also heard in the private sector, use a checklist approach to determine which disclosures are required. So they'll go through all their standards and they'll say that we need disclosures A, B, and C. And they won't consider materiality or the usefulness of that information to the users. They'll just include them because the standard has indicated that it's required from a standard perspective. What this project would focus on is developing guidance to help public sector entities apply their professional judgment in determining what's material for users of the financial statements, in determining which disclosures are really useful. Because the more time that those entities allocate to providing or developing disclosures that aren't useful is really resources that could be better allocated to other aspects of the public sector entity. As I move into the far right of this slide, these are the major projects. And like I said, these are major projects because the IPSASB will have to do a lot of greenfield thinking in developing these projects and have to develop significant consensus as they move forward with these projects. The first one is presentation of financial statements. Presentation of financial statements is a really important project because this is how users of the financial information interact with those public sector entities. It's how they get their information financially about those entities. And as a result, any way the IPSASB can simplify that information, make it more digestible to those users, makes those financial statements more useful to everyone involved. This project will focus on the structure of the financial statements. It will look at the minimum reporting requirements, and it will also consider the content of the financial statements, including disclosures. One of the challenges that this project will present, and the IPSASB hasn't really discussed this at all yet because the project obviously hasn't been added yet, but I spoke a little bit about our Theme B projects where there's an alignment with IFRS push where that's appropriate. But also as part of our Theme B projects, we also consider whether alignment with international statistics is appropriate, or GFS. And I can see with this project a push and a pull within the board and outside of the board, whether there should be more of an alignment with the private sector accounting standards, whether there should be more alignment with government financial statistics, or whether there should be somewhere in the middle, whether there's a compromise or maybe there's accounting policy options. I can see this being a big debate within and, like I said, outside the board. The final project I want to touch on is the large light blue ball in the bottom right of the screen, and this is differential reporting. And this project really goes back to that slide I illustrated where you saw more and more constituents are expected to apply an accrual-based accounting by 2030. And while that's excellent news for the IPSASB, one of the challenges that we hear is IPSAS is digestible and I don't want to say easy to apply, but easier to apply when you have the resources available to consider the IPSAS and determine how they should be applied to your public sector entity. And that's generally easier at large public sector entities that will have large accounting departments. But where IPSAS can be more challenging to apply is when you're a smaller public sector entity where the accounting group might be one or two individuals. And as a result, it's a very onerous lift in order to apply the full suite of IPSAS to a smaller or less complex entity with a smaller accounting department. So the focus of this project would really be to develop an accounting framework for less complex public sector entities. Now, the biggest challenge going into this project is, I said this project would look at developing an accounting framework for less complex entities. Right now, the IPSASB doesn't know what a less complex entity is. There'd have to be a significant amount of research to determine what that is and find out what constituents think that is. And then on the other side of that, an accounting framework or developing an accounting framework for those less complex entities also raises some question marks and will require significant research as well. One of the challenges will be this accounting framework still needs to be consistent with the robust requirements of existing IPSAS, but still needs to be a more simplified version so that it can be applied by those entities with limited resources to apply IPSAS. This might be in the form of fewer accounting policy options. It might be fewer disclosures. There's a few different options out there, but this is the challenge that the IPSASB will really wrestle with as the IPSASB looks at these two projects. The final point that I wanted to make before I ask Beatriz to come on and take some live questions and we start to move through some of those live questions is, if you think back to the work program slide that I showed, a number of those projects that are currently ongoing are very transaction specific. So they're specific to a certain type of transaction. So revenue, natural resources, leases. But what you can see, especially with our major project on the right-hand side of this slide, is they're much more broad in scope. And that really is because the IPSASB has really filled a number of the gaps in its current literature. And they're also considering the types of constituents that are expected to adopt IPSAS as we move forward over the next 10 years or so. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take any questions that have come in. I'll ask Ross to come on as well and help me answer any questions that come through.
Muchas gracias, doctor. Bien, tenemos una...
Thank you very much, Doctor. We have a question in the chat. Giovanni is asking if the differential reports, would that be a standard that IPSASB would implement? The question also says if the implementation of the IPSAS depends on the IT tools that you use to manage income and expenses. This requires time, human and financial resources, because these are complex systems that have been designed, decades ago. And, and then we will have the standards issue. So what's your opinion about this issue? And there's another question about the differential reports. There's if the policy will remain that those reports are for general use. If you could respond, maybe Ross or...
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I guess my answer is it will depend on the project itself. So at this point, the board's just proposing that we take on the idea of developing a differential reporting standard. And if that project comes on the work program, as Dave noted, it would be a wholesale project that would require a consultation paper. And in that consultation paper, the board will propose a number of different options of what a differential reporting model will look like. But as they haven't started that project, they haven't developed those various options as of yet. So we'll have to wait and see what the options look like. But the spirit of this project, or the reason for doing this project, is to look for elements of what makes a less complex entity in the public sector and develop more simplified reporting requirements for those types of entities to help make sure more entities can move to IPSAS, with the realization that when a less complex entity has relatively simple transactions, the number of IPSAS that we need to apply would be limited, and there could be possible models that propose less stringent recognition and measurement requirements or disclosure requirements or both. So that's really what the board will look at in those projects. Thank you.
Bien, muchas gracias.
Great, thank you very much. I think those are the only questions we have so far in the chat. I think there's another one coming in. It's asking whether IFAC or the board has considered issuing guidelines for the implementation of an ICSP, considering that this time many countries are facing those difficulties. There's also another question from Costa Rica about the public sector, that an important issue is to recognize the relevance of the service potential in assets and not so much their economic performance. Now, most of the calculations for revaluation, deterioration, or others, you require cash flows to calculate present value. However, if you don't have actives that seek that economic performance, it becomes more complex to determine those values in Costa Rica. If you could also respond to that question.
So maybe I can take the first half of that, Dave, and you can pick up the measurement part afterwards. So just to highlight that later in today's event, Leka from IFAC will be talking about a number of tools that have been developed and one important one that's under development that might help with the request for, I think in the question they said guidelines for helping with the implementation of Ipsas. And there is one product that IFAC's been working on for a while called Pathways to Accrual that will give a number of, I wouldn't call them guidelines, but kind of considerations for jurisdictions going through accrual transition to look at when developing their project implementation phase and the various steps needed to move to an accrual basis of accounting. And Laura will touch on that in a little bit, and that product is expected by the end of this year. So that might help significantly entities that are looking at implementing Ipsas. Dave, over to you on the measurement question.
So excellent question from my perspective, and I think it's going to be where the IPSASB will spend much of 2022. And I say that because in the exposure draft ED 77, which just closed yesterday, one of the challenges that the IPSASB tried to address, I think if I understood the question correctly, is the issue you just raised. And that is that a number of measurement bases that currently exist in Ipsas focus on a financial capacity. And generally what that means is if it's a current value measure, if I focus on assets, it's how much could you receive to sell the asset. But I correctly agree with you that in the public sector, a significant number of assets aren't held for their financial capacity, they're held for their service capacity. So if I go back to my school example, in the private sector, there's always an assumption that it will generate cash flows or revenues in some regards, or at the end of the day, you could always sell it. But in the public sector, you're not holding that school to generate revenues. You're holding it to educate citizens and hopefully make the country better from an educational perspective going forward. And I think your question really gets to the heart of that. How do we value it from that perspective? So the IPSASB in its exposure draft has proposed what we call current operational value. And this really focuses on the service capacity measurement of those assets and is really focusing on the service delivery objective of those assets. And one of the keys to that measurement basis is you focus on what the asset is currently being used for. And that's different than a number of other measurement bases that require a highest and best use concept. So again, returning to my school example, this measurement basis, the public sector specific measurement basis, expects you to measure the school as it is a school, not as its highest value in which it could be sold for, which is maybe a residential complex or an office complex. The reason why I say at the IPSASB, I can see them spending a lot of time in 2022 on this is the proposal that went out. I expect there to be strong support for current operational value and principle, but I think 2022 will really be spent refining the concepts there. So excellent question. I hope I answered it for you.
Bien. Sí, muchas gracias, doctor.
Yes, thank you very much. There's just one final question. It's a general question, but if you could perhaps just give us some details. The question is about the countries that have implemented the norms. Ipsas, how have they done that? Which projects have been successful? Mainly in Latin America, where for different reasons it has been difficult to implement. So it's a broader question, but if any of you would like to mention countries that have gone through a successful process, hopefully you can respond to this.
So I'll take that one, Dave, at least a first start. If you want to come in after, feel free to do so. But there are many countries you can look to that have been successful in the adoption implementation of Ipsas. And I'd like to highlight the recent International Public Sector Financial Accountability Index that surveyed 165 countries and sets out the different states of accrual adoption across the world, as well as the projections going forward for 2025 and 2030. And again, Laura will touch on this later in her presentation from the IFAC perspective. But if you're looking for jurisdictions that have already made the transition fully to accrual, that's a good place to start if you want to do some research. Rather than focusing on individual countries, I think it's important to focus on the elements that make a transition program successful. And when we speak to jurisdictions that have been able to move to accrual accounting sufficiently, there are some common elements that we normally see. And probably the most important one at the outset of the project is political will and buy-in for the movement to accrual. And that's simply because if you don't have sufficient support from governments and the political side of governments, it's very challenging to effect change in moving to accrual and doing so in an effective way. Another element that we find that makes a successful accrual transition to accrual is undertaking that accrual transition as part of a broader public financial management reform project. So not trying to do it as an accounting exercise in isolation, but rather doing it as part of a comprehensive reform program in bettering public management. And lastly, I think the element that we see that really makes a difference is a detailed, realistic plan on the timelines and the needs for an accrual financial system. So as alluded to in many of the questions that have come through the chat, it requires changes to IT systems. It requires often upscaling and upskilling human resource capacities on both the preparer side from your accountants to make sure you've got accountants who can use accrual standards, as well on the audit side to make sure the auditors are ready to audit such statements when you get there. So it really is important to have a detailed, realistic plan that thinks through all of those elements in advance of making the movement to accrual. And that's just to avoid the pitfall that we often see of those transitions stalling and losing momentum because of lack of political will, lack of funding, or lack of planning related to the needs of IT systems, human resources, and overlooking how the information will be used for purposes other than financial reporting. So the accrual information you get from Ipsas is useful for financial reporting, of course, but it's also very useful for other purposes, such as an input for budgeting, as an input for statistical reporting, and even just for general management and decision-making. Thank you.
Okay, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. I think we have 1 or 2 minutes left to answer just 2 general questions. they're asking whether there is any example of differential reporting that allows us to understand how a simplified report, different from the current general purpose ones, would allow a better implementation of Ipsas. The second question is in reference to the training of trainers on the Ipsas. What have the results been, I think, by IFAC?
So maybe if I can pick those up as well. So maybe I'll start with the train the trainer question because I think it's a little more straightforward. So the results have been very positive on the train the trainer material. We've got a lot of feedback from different organizations on its usefulness and compliments that it is very helpful for training. The one criticism that we've received that we're working on now is trying to get that material into different languages. So it is a very expansive pack of slides and training material, but at the moment it's only in English. So we are looking at getting that into other languages, including Spanish. And we're working through different partners to try and get either donations of resources to facilitate that or donations in kind of translators who can help us with that. So I guess in terms of people on this call, stay tuned. It is something we're working on, and we hope in 2022 to start to make some progress on translating those materials so that they're readily available and easier to use in Latin America. On the first question, I think it's related to you know, where differential reporting would fit in our framework, and if that would change the requirements for our normal general purpose financial reports. And I don't believe the intention is that differential reporting would remove the current requirements around fair presentation of general purpose financial reports, but rather have a simplified reporting model for less complex entities. And as I said, so far the board hasn't any views on this because we haven't started that project, but that'll be the real key for this project, is how to define what a less complex entity is and where providing a different reporting model would be appropriate. But it wouldn't be to override what's in current IPSAS 1. For most entities, you know, your normal public sector entities, you'd still report under the normal IPSAS reporting model. It's more those, you know, small, less complex entities that we'd be targeting for the differential reporting project. Thanks.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, doctor.
Thank you very much, doctors, Ross, Dave. I think this issue of the Train the Trainers course on IPSAS, this is really something of interest for the countries in focal. And if it can be translated into Spanish, yes, of course, we will be alert. We will be waiting for that to be translated. And that would also respond to the last comment, you know, how can we get the training? So I think we will be waiting for those materials. Thank you very much for your responses. Thanks for the questions.
Thank you very much for the questions. And Laura will have a little more information on Train the Trainer later in the session. Kamira, can I ask you to come back on? And Ross, maybe you have one final thing to say before we wrap up this Q&A.
Just thanks from me for the engagement from the participants today. It's great to have an active Q&A session, and really looking forward for the questions to keep coming in as we progress through the webinar today. So thank you very much.
Gracias, Dave. Gracias, Ross y Beatriz.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Ross and Beatriz, for the excellent question and answers session. Before moving on to the next subject, next topic, natural resources, I would like to tell you a little bit about the background of this natural resources project. In 2018, we had a consultation document, something about the work plan, something similar to what we're doing now, and based on the responses, we decided to incorporate the natural resources project on the IPSASB work plan. The objective is to develop norms on the accounting treatment of natural resources, recognition, measurement, presentation, and disclosures. Again, on the conceptual framework. And the idea is to reinforce public financing by adopting the norms, but the project does not include long-term sustainability issues. The focus of this consultation document that we're working on is to propose initial IPSASB's opinions on the accounting of natural resources. Now, Dave Warren will present details on this important project now. So thank you. Go ahead, Dave.
Thanks, Kamira. And the first point that Kamira made is where I want to start, and that's that back in 2018 and 2019, as we were developing the current strategy, one of the questions we asked were what projects are of highest priority in your jurisdiction. And for those of you that attended the FOCAL events in 2018 and 2019, you might remember that question. And what we heard consistently around the world is natural resources is an important project. And one of the reasons for that is because at its most basic level, a natural resource is a resource that exists without any human action. So that could be air, water, mineral resources such as oil, vegetation, or living resources such as animals. And like I said, in each case, there's no human action for those resources to exist. Now, something that really resonated with me is, and I assume with the board as well, one of the challenges that a number of jurisdictions identified is because there's no current IPSAS on natural resources, these resources aren't recorded in the financial statements. And some jurisdictions have significant natural resources that if they were put on the balance sheet in some way, this would drastically change the financial picture that was put forward to those users of the financial information. Something else that resonated is that in some jurisdictions, and this is specific to an oil example, some jurisdictions that don't record the value of oil said they struggle to know how much to charge in royalties or charge when they're selling the oil to private sector companies to extract that oil. And it really came back to if it's not being measured, the asset's not being managed appropriately. So those were two reasons where the IPSASB really thought it was important to take on this project. And that doesn't necessarily mean that natural resources will come on balance sheet, but it's the reason the IPSASB wanted to explore this and understand how they fit within the larger IPSASB conceptual framework. Now, where the IPSASB has spent a significant amount of time to date is really focusing on the scope of the project and by extension, a description of a natural resource from an IPSAS perspective. And you'll see on this slide the three orange bullets. These are really what the IPSASB is focused on in describing a natural resource. And what we'll see here is the first point is a natural resource from an IPSAS perspective has to meet the definition of a resource in the conceptual framework. And in the conceptual framework, a resource is an item that either provides economic benefit or it has some kind of associated service potential. So in this regard, all the natural resources that I listed, oil, air, animals, natural wildlife would all kind of fit into that economic resource or service potential perspective. When I move to the second point, it has to operate in a, or has to exist in its natural state, or sorry, I should say it's naturally occurring. And when I say it's naturally occurring, it goes back to how I first described natural resources, and that's that those natural resources exist without any human action. So the air around the world or the water, either in oceans or in lakes, exists without humans doing anything. And then the final point or the final criteria, and this is the most challenging as it relates to the IPSASB and where we're still trying to spend a lot of time, is the resource is still in its natural state. And what we mean by that is there's no human intervention. And this is important because this human intervention line, when there is human intervention, there are Ipsas that already exist telling you how to account for these natural resources. But when there is no human intervention, no guidance exists. And I think a good example of this would be if there's oil that's sitting currently underground. Prior to it being extracted, there is no guidance on how to account for that, no guidance on how to measure it, no guidance on whether it should be on the balance sheet or not. But as soon as it's being extracted from the ground, there's been some human intervention, and then we have guidance in the form of inventories that tells you how to account for that. Now, the challenge the IPSASB is really struggling with is, in my example, that extraction point or the human intervention point, I would argue is pretty clear. But there's other examples the IPSASB has discussed, such as putting a tracker on an animal or some sort of wildlife and discussing whether that relates to human intervention. And the reason I say that is putting a tracker on an animal, for example, that does constitute humans intervening in that living resource, but does it change the economic benefit or service potential related to that specific living resource? So what the IPSASB is really focusing on now is crispening what that human intervention means. The last point I really want to make on this slide is, and I said this back in the mid-period work program consultation discussion, is the Natural Resource Project really focuses on tangible natural resources. Intangible natural resources are outside the scope of this project. So oil, water, living resources, those types of resources you can touch are within the scope, but spectrum, air, those intangible resources, the ones that you can't touch, are outside of the scope. What this next slide really illustrates is pictorially, hopefully what I just communicated in words on a previous slide. And what I really want to focus on, I'll start on the left-hand side of this box, and what you'll see is, what I really want to draw your attention to on the left is that the horizontal line, is there human intervention or are they naturally occurring line? And like I said, that's really a defining line, and that if you're below that line, we do have Ipsas that exist that tell you how to account for those natural resources that have had some kind of human intervention. But if you're above the line, no guidance currently exists. If I go up to the top, you'll see the tangibles divide, and that's where you start to see the scope of this project. And I said, if you're intangibles, you're outside of the scope of this project. But if you're tangibles, you're in the dark blue area, and the dark blue area is what's inside the scope of this project. Now, the next point, I haven't really touched on this yet, is the other vertical line, and that's right in the middle of this diagram. And that's really what I consider to be the measurement line. And I say that because in a number of cases, you'll have natural resources that, for the most part, meet the definition of an asset or a resource in the conceptual framework. But the challenge you run into is they can't be measured in a reasonable way. So going back to oil that's sitting underground, you might know it's there. You might know that it's an economic resource. It's got the ability to generate cash flows going forward. But it's very difficult to know how much oil is underground until you extract it all. So you're in this very difficult place where, again, you know the resource is there, but it's very difficult to record in any kind of financial circumstances because you can't measure it. And that's where you kind of move to the right-hand side of this line, and that's our recommended practice guidelines 1, 2, and 3. And these recommended practice guidelines were written about just over 10 years ago by the IPSASB, and they're a really excellent framework to help with those assets and liabilities that don't meet the definition for being recorded as an asset or liability in the financial statements, but that require some sort of additional information that can be provided outside of the financial statements. And then when I move to the far right of this diagram, the light blue area, this talks about possible future projects. And Kamira touched on this a little in her introduction. And the IPSASB always has an eye to the future when it comes to natural resources. And I'll touch on this in a couple of slides, but this goes really to our sustainability reporting initiative that's really starting to get underway. And while that sits outside of the Natural Resources Project, it is all linked to kind of the broader scope of natural resources that the IPSASB is thinking about in the context more broadly of natural resources. So I talked about the resources that were in the scope of this project, and I said they were tangible natural resources. The three that the IPSASB is specifically addressing are mineral resources, water, and living resources. And while this covers a significant portion of those natural resources that public sector entities deal with, it's not the entire scope of natural resources. And like I said, it doesn't cover intangible natural resources, but it also doesn't cover all tangible natural resources. And the reason why the IPSASB picked these three are these are the real three that constituents identified are the most important to them. And they're also the three that the IPSASB can see it making real progress on in a reasonable amount of time. So the IPSASB did weigh the importance of getting something to market so that it can be applied by constituents in practice. And that takes me to the timeline on the right of this slide. And you can see that in 2020, so only last year actually, this project was approved by the IPSASB. And in the past year or so, the IPSASB has really been working on developing its concepts and developing its preliminary views to expose those to constituents to get a sense of whether that's consistent with what its constituents believe are the appropriate concepts for accounting for natural resources. And then after that, in 2023, we'll spend the year, or hopefully spend the year developing the exposure draft. And then by 2024, if everything goes according to plan, we'll issue a final standard. The one point I'll make here, and I'll tie it back to my mid-period work program consultation, is that you can see adding a consultation phase, so kind of those first two boxes on the far right. It adds a significant amount of time and resources to projects. So that's why we really bifurcate our projects into minor projects and major projects, and that defining line is really based on a consultation paper. So this slide really focuses on the right-hand side of that diagram that I just went through, the scope diagram. And what it really focuses on are the challenges the IPSASB is trying to address as it relates to the disclosure of information. And I guess that relates really to either whether natural resources are recognized directly in the financial statements, or probably those more difficult scenarios where natural resources aren't recognized in the financial statements in any way because they can't be really measured. So that goes to my oil example where the oil is sitting underground, but you don't really know how much is there. From this perspective, the IPSASB is spending a lot of time really addressing what the appropriate level of disclosure is and how best users can be served by knowing about those natural resources. And what you'll see in the, it's a very light gray box, but it's it's the fourth box down, the light gray. You'll see that we've listed the three recommended practice guidelines that really outline, like I said, a really good framework for determining right now what should be applied in, or what can be useful information to users of financial information as it relates to information that sits outside the financial statements. Before we get into questions, and I was told before the event to expect a significant number of questions as it relates to natural resources because this would be a hot topic in Latin America, I thought I'd close off and talk about our sustainability reporting initiative, and I'll tie it back to our mid-period work program consultation as well. I have two slides here, and the first one really focuses on what has the IPSASB done to date. And you can see we have three buckets here. The first one on the far left is the Natural Resource Project that's currently ongoing. Like I said on the previous few slides, I spent quite a bit of time on this. We're developing a consultation paper right now. It's expected to be approved in March 2022 and probably issued about a month later in April 2022. The IPSASB chair, Ian Carruthers, has developed a sustainability reporting webpage. And on this page, he's trying to keep this updated regularly on what the IPSASB is doing as it moves this significant initiative forward. And I say that because it feels like every morning when I wake up and log on to my emails, there's a new sustainability reporting email and more progress that's been made. So this is a very quickly advancing project from a standard setting perspective. And we're trying to keep our constituents in the know as to what the IPSASB is doing and how it's engaging as it relates to sustainability reporting. And then the last aspect that I wanted to highlight is the far right. Last summer, the IPSASB issued a Q&A that highlighted which guidance is available as it relates to sustainability reporting, and it really focuses on, again, going back to those recommended practice guidelines, what's available currently that our constituents can apply if they want to start doing a form of sustainability reporting. So my last slide focused on what we've done, and this slide really focuses on the future. And I'll tie this back to the mid-period work program consultation in that, if you remember, I think this is my first slide, I talked about when the IPSASB was adding to its work program, there's three themes, A, B, and C. And C is really other reporting guidance. And the IPSASB, as part of this mid-period work program consultation, spent a lot of time debating whether sustainability reporting should be included in the current projects that are proposed to be added to the work program in 2022 and 2023. And if you go to my slide where I talk about the 6 projects, you'll see that sustainability reporting is not there. And the reason for that is, there's a few reasons. The first is, I said the mid-period work program consultation takes place within the context of the current strategy. And the IPSASB discussed how they thought it was a bridge too far to add such a significant project to the work program within the context of the current strategy. With the next strategy only being 2 years away, the IPSASB thought it was a better use of resources to really devote those resources to learning how a sustainability reporting project could take shape under the next strategy, assuming that the IPSASB goes in that direction. The second reason is, and I know I've said this a few times, but the IPSASB is actually in a really good position as it relates to its recommended practice guidelines. There is a very strong framework right now that exists under Ipsas that explains how sustainability reporting can look, and it's all within the recommended practice guidelines. And it really, like I said, just outlines a framework that can be applied by public sector entities today. Now, I've said the IPSASB isn't proposing to add a project now, but I think probably the most important takeaway from this slide is that doesn't mean we're not doing anything. One of the key decisions that the IPSASB made is this will be a resource-intensive project, and there are a number of other organizations that have significant resources already devoted to sustainability reporting, and the IPSASB should take the next 2 years really learning from them and understanding the best way to take the IPSASB sustainability reporting project forward. And the one I'll really focus on is the Ifrs Foundation, which is currently in discussions as to whether it should develop its own international sustainability standards board. And I believe that decision will come out in the next week or so. Apologies. And when that decision comes out, what the IPSASB's done as part of the development of that board and going forward, the IPSASB is currently an observer in the development of that sustainability board and hopes to be so should that board go forward. And there's really 2 objectives from the IPSASB's perspective. One, like I said, is really to learn from the Ifrs Foundation and learn from its mistakes as it goes forward in developing this board for the first time, and learn from its successes. And then also, as the International Sustainability Standards Board will focus primarily or exclusively on the private sector, this is an opportunity for the IPSASB to offer its expertise in the public sector and make sure that where appropriate, those are considered and filtered into the International Sustainability Standards Board so that the IPSASB is engaged and hopefully makes the IPSASB's life easier when this project is, I expect, to be added to our strategy in the next strategy period. So I will stop there as it relates to natural resources and sustainability reporting. And if there's any questions in the Q&A, I ask that my fellow panelists come on now and we can start to work through them and answer those questions.
Gracias. Muchas gracias, doctor Dave.
Well, thank you very much, Dave. Welcome all to the Q&A session of our roundtable. We do have some questions on the chat. Let's start with the first one. The items of financial statements, assets, liabilities, incomes, and expenses are attributable to an entity that provides a report. But in terms of natural resources, such as, for instance, underlying oil or marine life, what entity would they be attributed to? Because they can be identified as part of a nation, but they are not necessarily attributed to a specific entity. The next question, are there any difficulties in order to measure, there is an inconvenience in trying to measure natural resources because of their nature. So how will we approach this in the future? Finally, a few years ago, the controller objected to our financial statements because we didn't register the value of the land, Agua de Rio, for the Itaipu, the water reservoir. We don't actually know exactly what are the assets for the tangible assets for the states, and what do we do when we still have to register the actual challenges of donated goods to combat the pandemic, then we haven't yet valued or accounted for. Can the controlling bodies recommend this kind of accountability or registry?
So thanks. I'll try and handle each of those questions one by one, if that's okay. So to your first question about the reporting entity that would recognize these items and how it would work, the approach we're proposing in our consultation paper is a control-based approach. So you'd have to look at the facts and circumstances of which entity in a jurisdiction has the right to control those assets and liabilities related to natural resources. And then should they meet the recognition criteria that's in line with our conceptual framework, you would be able to recognize those items. Now, at this point, it is a consultation paper, so it's high level based on the concepts. We don't have a draft standard as of yet, but it would really come down to whether the nation or reporting entity itself is able to demonstrate control over those natural resources. To the second question on measurement of natural resources, we don't have specific measurement requirements yet. Again, that'll be addressed in the exposure draft phase of the project. We will follow the current consultation paper phase. What we're focusing on is whether or not you would measure them for their financial capacity or their service potential. And then should they be measurable, you would recognize them. But the actual details related to how you would measure those would come in when we start drafting the future standard and start thinking practically about the measurement aspects. And on the last question, the third question you provided on the Controller General's Office challenge related to the recognition of, I think it's land and water, you know, and whether the controlling bodies can recommend this type of registry. This is a challenging one with limited details for me to give much of a view on without more specific details. I would say there is guidance on the recognition and measurement of land in Ipsas 17 that you could look to that might help from an accounting perspective. But I'm a little bit lost on what the practical challenges are with this current scenario. So I can't add much more at the moment. Thanks.
Gracias, Dr. Dave. Tenemos dos preguntas más en nuestro chat.
Thank you, Dr. Dave. We have another two questions in the chat. Costa Rica is asking, natural resources, can they be considered a segment according to NICS 18? The next question. Have you considered that the regulation of natural resources could be a focus for disclosure for natural resources? I mean, have you considered that regulation for natural resources may be done under a focus to review of disclosure due to the difficulties in measuring them?
Excuse me. Yes. So that is going to be an important part of the consultation paper, is for those items that you can't recognize because they don't meet the recognition criteria or because you can't measure them, that there would be disclosures required. And we're looking at a number of different disclosure approaches within the financial statements and in broader financial reporting that would allow the entity responsible for these items to provide more information on those. So that is very much part of the project's considerations. On IPSAS 18, hard to say at the moment if you could provide segment disclosures on IPSAS 18, because technically we don't have requirements for natural resources in the standards as of yet. So I'm not sure it's possible to recognize those items, so I'm not sure how you could disclose them. But if there's maybe some more specific thinking that, you know, on this one, someone's thinking they want to send us a comment offline, happy to consider it further.
Gracias. Tenemos una última pregunta en el
Thank you. There
chat.
is one last question in the chat. Have you evaluated the possibility of acknowledging assets in natural resources that generate income, such as royalty through concession contracts? For example, the concession of electromagnetic spectrums or the concession of fishing areas or the use of waterways. All these contracts generate income for a country, so you can determine the future flows and therefore to register in the asset. Could you confirm if this is a correct interpretation, or what does IPSASB think about this in this aspect?
I can't comment on what IPSASB might think about this, but I can give you my own personal view. And I think when you're talking about agreements where the rights related to certain assets, liabilities, such as electromagnetic spectrum, fishing rights, and a process has been put in place to quantify those rights and sell those rights to another party, I think those are already covered in IPSAS standards, in our intangible asset standards, and in some cases financial instruments, depending on how those rights are bundled into an arrangement. So the board's not addressing those types of arrangements specifically in this. However, one of the things, or the reasons why the board's undertaking the minor amendment project to intangible assets is to add more public sector examples to help with the articulation and application of the general principles to more public sector issues, such as electromagnetic spectrum is one, and other rights, such as fishing rights and things, and such arrangements that would fall under those standards that we already have.
Muchas gracias.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for your questions, and thank you for your answers. And we'd like to welcome Dr. Laura so that she can discuss the next item on the agenda. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be participating in today's webinar, and thank you to FOCAL and to IPSASB for organising the event and inviting me to join. Just a bit of background first. I work for the International Federation of Accountants, that's IFAC. For anybody not familiar with IFAC, it is the global organisation for the accountancy profession with 180 member and associate organisations in 135 countries and jurisdictions, representing more than 3 million professional accountants. And for this final session of the agenda, I will be sharing a brief overview of IFAC's activities and initiatives at an international level to support the adoption and implementation of accrual accounting in the public sector. So I'll start with the global picture, and I know both Dave and Ross have already mentioned the International Public Sector Accountability Index, and that we're seeing more public sector entities moving to accrual. So I just wanted to provide a little more detail on the index and the trends that it highlights. The index was first compiled by SIPFA and IFAC in 2018 to really understand the global picture in terms of public sector financial reporting. And then to monitor progress, it's been more recently updated with 2020 actual data, as well as 2025 forecasts and 2030 projections. And just to mention that in compiling the data, it involved a rigorous process to ensure that the data was collected on a consistent basis, and also, importantly, that it was backed up with supporting evidence. The index covers 165 jurisdictions, and the headline is that currently 30% of those 165 reported on accrual in their 2020 financial statements. And this is an increase of 6% compared to the 2018 index. And we're also seeing a positive rising trend. So you can see on the graph here that in 2025, the forecast is an increase to 50% using accrual. And there is a significant accrual adoption activity underway across all regions of the world, but just to highlight Latin America and the Caribbean specifically, this is a region that is expected to see one of the greatest increases in accrual adoption between 2020 and 2025, increasing from 9 jurisdictions currently to 15 in 2025. And then looking ahead to 2030, and the current projection globally is that 73% will be used in accrual. And although inevitably this is subject to more uncertainty, particularly in the current environment where reform programs may be impacted by the pandemic, it may be that some countries may not achieve accrual by 2030, but it also could be that there are some other countries who will get to accrue who aren't currently showing on the index. So I think overall safe to say that there is a significant shift from cash to accrual reporting by governments over the next 10 years. And then also just to highlight that alongside the move to accrual, the index also looks at financial reporting frameworks and the extent to which IPSAS are being used. And that's either directly with no modifications, indirectly with modifications for local context, or as a reference to developed national standards. And the trend in IPSAS usage and influence is also positive. So in 2020, of those reporting on accrual, 57% are using IPSAS in one of those 3 ways. In 2025, that increases to 73%, and by 2030, the current projection is 81%. And this is really positive because as well as needing accrual reporting across jurisdictions, it's also important to have that comparability as well. And just really to echo what Dave said earlier, I think the results of the index do demonstrate an increased demand on the IPSASB and its work program. And it also shows that there is great need for both advocacy and support for implementation. So that brings me on to my next slide, and looking at promoting IPSAS adoption and implementation, which is another theme in IPSASB's strategy and work plan. And IPSASB has a very active approach to outreach. So with events like today, it enables them to engage in a global dialogue with constituents. And I think it was Ross that mentioned it earlier, but it's important to recognise that to be successful, a move to accrual is usually part of a much larger reform programme. And that requires changes across a range of areas that include professional skills and capacity, systems, internal controls and processes for reporting transactions. And this involves a number of different groups with different skills and expertise at various stages throughout the transition process. And the table on the slide here just shows the primary and potential roles across the various types of organisations, particularly at a national level to support adoption and implementation. For IFAC's part and our role at an international level, contributing to and promoting the development, adoption and implementation of high-quality international standards is one of our strategic objectives, and this includes supporting IPSASB in its work. And as part of our advocacy efforts, we actively promote the adoption of IPSAS. And just to share a couple of examples of this, in IFAC's recently published 2021 G20 Call to Action, championing public financial management is one of 2 key actions. And we see high-quality global public sector accounting standards as a critical foundation to this. And then as part of IFAC's B20 engagement, IFAC efforts have put the need to improve efficiency of public administrations as one of the policy recommendations of the global business community. Apologies. This recommendation includes specific mention of accrual accounting. Sorry, my apologies for the call in the background there. These are just examples of promoting adoption, but IFAC has also been working closely with IPSASB to play a greater role in supporting implementation. And I'd like to just highlight some recent projects. If we could go to the next slide. So IFAC's four main projects are listed on the slide here, and I've already covered the index, and I know the train the trainer and pathways to accrual has been mentioned also. So just to go over these in brief. Firstly, the COVID-19 intervention assessment tool. So in the context of the massive fiscal interventions globally and the knock-on increases in government borrowing, it is vital that the world's governments advance from crisis response to recovery with sustainable fiscal programs that are affordable over the long term. And to help governments understand the impact of interventions, IFAC and the Zurich University of Applied Sciences, in partnership with IPSASB, created this COVID-19 intervention assessment tool. And the tool provides an immediate way of evaluating the economic impacts of current and planned policy initiatives and interventions, including, importantly, the impact on the balance sheet. And recognizing that full implementation of accrual-based accounting and reporting is still a long-term endeavor for many governments, this practical tool can be used independently of any given jurisdiction's public sector accounting basis. The next one I wanted to cover was Train the Trainer on the next slide, which I know has got a lot of interest already on this webinar. But just to give a bit of background, so IFAC does not provide certifications or training or continuing professional development. So the intention with these materials was to make them available so that IFAC's members, the professional accountancy organizations, and other stakeholders and partners can use them for training in their own jurisdictions and update them where necessary to incorporate country-specific requirements or considerations. And the material is intended to assist governments and government organizations currently on a cash basis or a near cash or modified cash basis of accounting and in the process of transitioning to accrual Ipsas. There are 10 modules that you see on the slide here, and the emphasis really is on areas that are considered to be the most significant to public sector entities transitioning to Ipsas for the first time. So the modules cover an introduction, assets, liabilities, revenues, expenses, financial instruments, consolidation and public sector combinations, presentation, first-time adoption of accrual basis IPSAS, and other pronouncements. And each module has the training manual and a set of accompanying slide decks, which have notes for the trainer. And then each module is broken down into a series of topics that are as far as possible, standalone. So they can be delivered as individual sessions, and presenters can pick and choose which topics to focus on and in which order to run sessions. And they have been developed with students in mind, so they do include practical examples. There are review questions to test understanding, and they can be used for in-person or virtual training sessions. And we launched these materials in English in November 2020. And as Ross mentioned, we have had some positive feedback from those that have used them to deliver training. And again, as was raised earlier on the webinar, we are aware that there is great demand for translations of these materials. And we are currently looking to translate them into both French and Spanish as a priority for the next phase of the project in 2022. And then finally, on pathways to accrual, just to give a bit of background on this project, it is an update to the Study 14 guidance that was published back in 2010. And Study 14 is non-authoritative, but it is regarded as an important reference point for jurisdictions contemplating a move to an accounting framework based on IPSAS or directly using IPSAS. And IPSASB undertook some stakeholder engagement in 2019 to get feedback on how Study 14 was being used and what was and wasn't useful. And I think the feedback included that although the guidance is technically sound, it is very long. So it currently is a PDF document that's over 300 pages and maybe a little too theoretical in places and technical, and could use more practical examples. And these are just some of the issues that are being addressed as part of its update. So firstly, it's been renamed Pathways to Accrual. We have been working with SIPFA and IPSASB to update the content to try and make it more practical, with a discussion of the various transition paths to accrual, an identification of the main tasks and issues, and some practical suggestions and case study examples. And the updated guidance will be incorporated into an online platform to make it easier to navigate than the previous PDF document. And this will also allow us to add in other relevant resources from IFAC and from IPSASB and others that can be referenced and linked to the various sections. And then once it's live later this year, the intention is that over time, additional examples will be added to help illustrate how practical challenges in initiating and managing an accrual implementation program have been overcome. So I will end my presentation then. Thank you so much for listening. I'm very happy to take any questions if there are any. I know the links to all of the resources that I mentioned will be sent out to you as well so that you can look at these. But I'll pass back to Dave, I think.
Thanks, Laura. Beatriz, do we have any questions in the Q&A?
Sí, gracias. Sí tenemos,
Yes, thank you. We do have questions for this last session of the roundtable. We have a question from Peru. They're asking, when would the translation into Spanish be available for these training materials? And there's also another general comment. It says that in Costa Rica, we have the paradigm of budget accounting. That's part of the culture of the government accountants. This culture came from international entities in the 70s and 80s. Now, changing this paradigm is the main objective of the implementation team for the Ipsas in the country. And all international entities need to understand the difference between the cash accounting and accrual accounting in their request or their requirements for Ipsas. So that would be something significant so that we can adapt to the accrual accounting. There's also a comment. It says that the translation of the 10 modules would require some time. So in any case, maybe summaries might be provided, or they could be disseminated through roundtables like this one, because we see it's a lot of material. It's very valuable, but also very long. And another question, this is for Laura. How are the Ipsas being harmonized with the Sustainable Development Goals? How is this being harmonized? And if you could share links to the Ipsas tools, and well, the materials that were presented today will be available for you after this session. If you could please, Laura, respond to the questions.
Yeah, very happy to do so. Thank you. I guess I'll kick off, but Ross and Dave, please feel free to jump in if there's anything I miss. Just in terms of timeline on translations of Train the Train, and I think you made the comment already that it is a big undertaking. We are currently looking at options for translating the materials at the moment, but as you said, there are 10 modules. There's I think approximately 40 slide decks as well to translate. We like to have one official translation of the product, and then it's available then on our website for others to request permission to use and reproduce. It's still in the early stage at the moment, so unfortunately I'm not able to give a better idea of timescale, just to say that it's absolutely a priority of ours when we're actively exploring options to get this translated as soon as possible. Whether we could get this done in phases, perhaps module by module, I'm not sure yet, but it is something that we are looking into, and we'll keep Focal up to date as we go with the project. I think there was another question on the harmonization of IPSASB with SDGs. I think I'll probably let Ross and Dave take that. I know IPSASB have produced some great guidance on how their standards are applicable, so maybe I'll hand that one over.
Yeah, so on that, I wouldn't really call it harmonization between the standards, because the SDGs are, broader than financial reporting, and there are a number of metrics that relate to financial and non-financial reporting. But the way we look at it in our view, and we've got a staff question and answer document on climate change that talks about this a little bit, and we can provide a link to that after. But I think many of the SDGs have a financial resources aspect to them if governments want to, comply with the SDGs. So we think, the contribution to the SDGs from the Ipsas is that we provide financial reporting standards that provide for good financial reporting and good governance around financial resource matters that will be very helpful in achieving the financial related SDGs. The second aspect is that the broader non-financial RPGs, Sustainable Development Goals, also require financial resources to make improvements and impacts. So we think by effectively managing public finances, it allows for those broader, more climate and social related Sustainable Development Goal metrics to be met. You have the resources available to fund programs and make improvements in that area. So that's kind of our view strategically on how the SDGs play in with the IPSAS standards. But I would say that we take note of the SDGs and we promote them, but I wouldn't say there's an ability to harmonize accounting requirements with the SDGs per se. Thanks.
Bien, gracias, doctora. Tenemos también otra pregunta.
Thank you, Dr. Leka. We have another question in the chat. They're asking whether within the IPSASB work program you have contemplated the translation of this materials, training for trainers, but into Portuguese. Have you considered that?
Thank you for the question, and it's a great question. I mean, ideally, we'd like to translate this into as many languages as possible. At the moment, our priority is on French and on Spanish. I know there are also some ongoing translations into Japanese and Arabic, and I believe that they came through our member requests for translation. So again, that's also another way that these things get translated, and that's through direct requests to IFAC by one of our member bodies to translate into their language. I'm not aware yet of any requests to translate into Portuguese, but certainly another language to look at. At the moment, though, IFAC and IPSASB, our focus is on the French and Spanish.
Muchas gracias, doctora.
Thank you very much. And doctor, thank you for your response. I think that this also answers partially a question we're asked here in reference to this training for trainers. How can we get involved in that program? How can we participate? What's the procedure? And I think you just mentioned that.
So just in terms of IFAC, so we don't offer training ourselves. So the with the materials, we have them on our website for use by others. If people would like to use the materials, there's a process to go through. I think that's highlighted on the website just to get permission to be able to use them, and that's I think if you follow the link that you're able to see that. But just in terms of actually running the training sessions itself, IFAC does not do that as part of our work.
Bien, muchas gracias,
Very
doctora.
well, thank you. There are no more questions in the chat. I think we can already close this part of the session, and then we'll let the president of the forum speak. Go ahead, Mr. Torres. Thank you very much. Thanks to all the panelists. I think we've had very, very valuable presentations and the comments we've heard. And I think it's been an important exercise to have a direct source on the standards we're trying to apply. I think it's been very interesting also in reference to the standards that you have been consulting about this year. So the intent of the forum is to continue forwarding the consolidated comments from the two sessions we've had this year. And I think that's also important so voices can be heard, and also our difficulties, our comments can be heard on the accounting standards being issued currently. I think we have a very clear perspective now on the direction of the effort undertaken by the IPSASB board, and I am very glad to see that you have on the table the differentiated reporting standards. We have differences in our countries at different levels in the public sector, different levels of accounting. The government profiles are very different. So I think this is going to help us a lot. Also, natural resources is a very helpful issue. In our country, we're doing some consultation on how to record some assets. So I think there is a will now to move forward on this topic, and I think our planet needs that so that we can measure these assets that are so relevant for everybody. Again, thank you very much to all the representatives of the IPSASB board for conducting this regional roundtable so that we can continue to have this communication between the forum, the regulators, and we will be waiting to see what happens with new projects. Greetings to all the members of FOCAL, and thank you for dedicating this couple of hours and for your participation. Everybody, I wish you a very nice day, and we will be publishing the IPSASB board links to the documents so you can consult them on your time, and we will be doing that, and we will be sending you the message so that you can follow the links. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a nice day. Thank you very much, Ross.